Good evening, everybody. I'm going to be talking about a range of topics this evening, and I'm going to start off by talking about some oats research which is going on at the moment. This isn't a completed project as Sarah's been describing on the spring barley. This is an ongoing project, but I'm just going to give you a bit of an update of what we're finding so far. But before we get going on that, I just had a couple of polls that I'd like to present. The first one, the question is, if you are growing or advising on oats, are the N rates you're applying A, following the current RB209 guidelines, B, higher than would be recommended by RB209 currently, or C, lower than RB209, or D, do you not consult RB209 for oats rates, or do you not know? So that's the first question to kick us off on the oats side of things. We'll just wait a few seconds for the results.
Yeah, I'll give it a few more. I'll close it.
Okay, so nearly half the people are following current RB209 guidelines, and about 30% don't consult RB209. So it's interesting also to see that 20% are lower and only 8% higher than what would be recommended by RB209. That's really interesting, and as you'll see a bit later in my presentation. And there's one more question I'd like to ask. This is about spring oats. And if you're growing spring oats or advising on spring oats, what proportion of nitrogen are you applying in the seed bed or within 5 days of drilling? So is it none, less than 25%, 25 to 50%, 50 to 75%, or more than 75%? So I'll just give you a few more seconds to answer that one, and we'll see the results. Um, 25 to 50% is the most popular there, and that tallies quite well with a survey that we've done as part of this oats project as well. So that's really useful and interesting. So thank you very much for responding to those polls. So I will just have to show my screen. So I shall, yeah, so hopefully.
Yeah, we can see that.
Has worked? Great.
You're good to go.
Thanks. So as I said, I'm going to be talking about an oats project that we've been doing for AHDB, and it's an industry funded project. And it started in 2018, but it's ongoing, as I said. So just a bit of background about oats. Oat supply and demand are both increasing, and this graph just shows over the last 20 or so years how the supply in the light blue and the demand in the red are increasing. It's a couple of years old now, but we recently heard that there's going to be an increased capacity at the Richardson's mill near Bedford over the next 18 months to 2 years, and also Oatly, who make the oat drink, are going to be producing that in the UK as well. So there's going to be increased capacity there too. So this demand is certainly increasing, and we're also seeing that growers are increasingly interested in growing oats as well, for a couple of reasons. Diversification of rotations as a replacement for oilseed rape, but also particularly for spring cropping, we've certainly seen a big increase in the proportion of spring oats that are grown for blackgrass avoidance and other methods. There are some issues with oats. There's quite a large gap between the average oats yields that you see in the DEFRA stats and other stats, and also the best farm yield. So there's this big, about 4 tonne per hectare gap between the average and the best yields. And some of the reason for that is there is a lack of knowledge about growing oats, both in terms of physiology and also agronomy. And physiology has taken a step forward understanding the physiology of oats, working with Quaker and other partners. We've developed the Oats Growth Guide now, which gives some good benchmarks for oat growing, which has really helped to start understanding the physiology better. But there's still a big gap in the agronomy. So this project that we're doing at the moment is trying to help improve yields and quality with nutrition. And quality for oats are particularly important. Growers often struggle to meet the specifications on specific weight and screenings. Those are 2 big issues. And also other quality parameters like kernel content and hullability. I haven't really got time to talk much about the quality results of this project this evening, but that will be a big part of this project as well. So where we started with this project was based on the findings from the 2016 RB209 review. This showed that there wasn't enough data to derive good recommendations for winter oats. It was clear from the results we had that actually the current recommendations back in 2016 were too low. So there was an increase of 40 kilos of N per hectare applied to all soil types and all SNS indices for winter oats. But there were absolutely no data on winter oats N timings and nothing at all on spring oats either in terms of the nitrogen rates or timings. And even if you look now at the RB209 in the spring oats section, there's a big gap where you might expect some instructions about timing. So there's clearly a need to improve the recommendations for oats. So this is where the Oats project came from, which we know as NoatS because we're looking at nitrogen and sulfur. So this is looking to provide advice on the best nitrogen rates and timings, and also thinking about sulfur applications to optimise yield. And as I said, quality is very important as well of both winter and spring oats. And we're really fortunate, as well as having AHDB funding this project, to have a really good consortium. And I'm really grateful for the consortium's contributions. We have everybody from the oats breeders right up through the fertiliser manufacturers up to the millers. So we're really pleased with that. So we have Aberystwyth University who breed oats, who are in charge of the quality aspect of the project. We also have input from Chuggas in Ireland and Segges in Denmark to help with augmenting the amount of data that we get. But we're really lucky to have this really good consortium that incorporates the whole of the oat supply chain. So when we started the project, because of the lack of information, we thought that it would be useful to have a survey about the current state of play of what growers and advisors were thinking about in terms of nutrition on winter and spring oats. And the first thing we looked at was whether the oats areas that people were growing or advising on were increasing or decreasing. And you can see from this graph here that for the winter oats on the left, about half of the advisors said their winter oats areas were either increasing or staying the same, and with more decreasing. But the spring oats, that was a crop that is really increasing and is continuing to do so. And we found in terms of the amount of nitrogen that was being advised to apply for winter oats, on average this was about 138 kilos of N per hectare, but there was very big range, you can see there, between 75 and 170 kilos of N. And for spring oats, the average amount being advised to apply was 118 kilos of N per hectare, and again there was a really big range. The winter oats timings were generally as per RB209, and the timings for spring oats, we generally saw that most people were applying around half in the seedbed, which tallies with the poll at the beginning of this presentation. So that's quite encouraging. So after the survey, we then established some trials. So we have a number of core trials in the NoatS project. These are augmented by some partner trials that some of the consortium partners are carrying out, which is really helpful, but we have a number of winter and spring oats core trials. So the winter oats trials, we planned 2 seasons of trials in Nottinghamshire and Herefordshire. Unfortunately, we weren't able to carry out any winter oats trials last season because of the really terrible autumn of 2019. We weren't able to establish those. So currently we've only got 1 season of data for these trials. But at each of these sites, we're looking at 3 different winter oats varieties, which are Miscani, Southwark and Penrose. And we're looking at 2 trials, so one, a nitrogen response trial with 6 nitrogen rates, and then we're also looking at a nitrogen timing trial with 6 nitrogen treatments at different timings, and also one with and without sulfur. Since we've only got 1 year's of data, I don't really want to present too much on that, but it's looking like the RB209 timings that people have been using are pretty reasonable. Another thing we saw was at the Nottinghamshire site, which is a really light land site, that sulfur was quite important for yield. But as you'd expect, the nitrogen rates, the optimum N rates did differ between those 2 sites. But when we have more data, there's currently site trials in the ground at the moment, which will augment that data set. So in terms of the spring oats, we've planned 3 seasons of trials for this. So we've carried out 2 seasons, and the 3rd season of these trials are in the ground at the moment. And these are being carried out in East Anglia and also in Kinross up in Scotland. Again, we've got 3 varieties for each of those sites, but they do slightly differ. So in the East Anglia, we have Canyon and Elian and Aspen, whereas up in Scotland, we have Canyon, Elian and Conway. So again, for each of these trials, we have 6 nitrogen rates in the nitrogen response trial, and we have 6 nitrogen timings treatments in the timing trial with and without sulfur as well. So just to give you a flavour of some of the results for the spring oats nitrogen response trial, this was the trial up in Scotland last season. And you can see here the nitrogen response curve similar to those that Sarah showed in her spring barley results. So along the x-axis we have the nitrogen rates, and then the yields up the y-axis. So we have the three varieties here, and we've got only a curve on the Elian because you can see that the Conway and the Canyon were still increasing their yields at the highest N rate, and this meant that actually I wasn't able to fit nitrogen response curves to this, but it just shows how much higher than the current recommendations in RB209 those Canyon and Conway would be. They'd be much higher than those. Elian, we were able to fit a curve, and that came out at an optimum N rate of 111 kilograms per hectare. Incidentally, the RB209 rate, taking account of the soil nitrogen supply for this site, would have been 140 kilos. So we've got another trial up in Scotland at the moment, which has been drilled and is looking good. So we shall see what happens this season. But we've also been looking at the quality of these samples from these nitrogen response trials. And we've got a couple of graphs here, specific weight on the left and the kernel content on the right. So a kernel content in oats, because we have husked oats, the kernel content is the percentage of the whole grain that is of the whole grain of the oat that is actually the kernel. So when you take away the husk in the milling process, what you're left with is the kernel, and that's generally over 75% of the weight of the whole grain. So what we see with a specific weight, as you increase the nitrogen rates, you often find that the specific weights are reduced. The responses at this trial site are slightly different to what we often see, which is you get an increase in specific weight as you go from 0 up to the next 2 or 3 N rates, and then a reduction. But this one is just going down as you increase the N rates. There is a big interaction with variety as well, and we see that quite commonly across different trial sites, where certain varieties maintain their specific weight really well across N rates, whereas others have quite a steep reduction in their specific weights. But you can still see that on average the specific weights are still above 50, which is generally the milling specification. So although specific weights often reduce as you increase or get to high N rates, the kernel content has the opposite effect. So you're seeing increases in kernel content with the increases in nitrogen rates. But again, we'll collate all the data from all the sites, and including 2021, to produce recommendations based on looking at yield and also quality aspect as well. So those are the nitrogen response trials. When we're thinking more about nitrogen timings, we're wondering, how can we use nitrogen timing to improve both yield and also quality? And if you have a look at some of the figures from the Oat Growth Guide, which you can download from various websites, I think also including the AHDB website, looking at the northern spring oats compared to the southern spring oats, you generally get about a week extra grain filling period. And this results in a higher biomass, and you also get a higher nitrogen uptake. and which results in a 0.2 tonnes per hectare higher yield for the oats grown in north versus the south, and also a higher 1,000 grain weight. And these figures are from the Oats Growth Guide, where you can see the specific weight at the northern sites are quite a bit higher than those in the south, and also the screenings are quite a bit lower. So do we need later nitrogen to maintain grain filling period and improve grain filling to improve quality? Back in 2019, as part of the NoatS project, CF Fertilisers worked with a farmer in Cheshire to have a look at this on his farm. So this farmer was growing spring oats. The field had quite a high nitrogen supply in the soil already, and so the nitrogen recommendation for this site would have been 75 kilos. But what they did in this field was to look at 3 different nitrogen strategies. The first one was not to apply any nitrogen, and then the second one was to look at nitrogen in the seed bed and then at the 3-leaf stage, and the third one was to have a later slant for the nitrogen applications, so none at the seed bed, some at the 3-leaf stage, and then some at the start of stem extension. Apologies for the complicated table at the bottom, but the main points to take away are the figures in bold, which are the yield, and you can see from those yields that the later timing treatment had a much higher yield than the earlier timing. So that grower there is certainly seeing the benefits of applying the nitrogen later. We could get into a debate about moisture availability in the soil, but I don't really have time to do that, unfortunately, today, but feel free to chip in with some questions a bit later on. So that's just a brief overview of this project. As I said, there will be a lot more results to come, but currently we're seeing from the database analysis that the nitrogen recommendations in RBO 209 at the moment are on the whole too low. For winter oats, we only have 1 year of data available at the moment, as I said, but there is some evidence that sulfur is particularly important for lighter soils. In terms of the spring oats, there's been quite a contrast, as you can imagine, between the East Anglian results and the Scottish results, with the dry springs in East Anglia resulting in lower yields and lower optimum N rates, whereas the results from the Scottish trials are giving high yields and high optima. In terms of looking at the timing, although we found in the sites that I described earlier that the later nitrogen may help to maintain grain filling, from the quality results that we've got from the trials, it appears that having some nitrogen in the seed bed is important for yield and also particularly for quality aspects. As I said earlier, we've got 1 more season of trials that we're carrying out at the moment, so the results from this project should be available by summer next year. So we'll get back to you with that one. Just want to finish with a bit of an advert. In 2021, we have a new yen category within the cereal yen, which is the oats yen. So I would encourage any oat growers out there to join this OATSN, because there is such a lack of information about oat agronomy and production. I think it's really important that we get as much information as possible to try and understand better what's happening with oats in terms of yield and quality, and I think OATSN should be able to help us with that.